Good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to see all you here. I mean, it's such an honor to speak to an audience that actually knows Elm beforehand, so thank you for coming. Yeah, as Brian said, I'm Ossi Hanhinen, and I am going to talk about beyond Hello World and to-do lists. So quickly about myself. I'm a front-end expert at Futurist nowadays. Futurist is a consultancy, so we work for customers. We do projects that are basically about half a year or so. That's like the medium size for us. And we are service creators, which means that we handle the business, the design, and the development. And I've been using Elm for more than a year at work in 2 different projects. I'm going to walk you through the basic idea of what the projects were a little later. I'm a person who likes to see what I've accomplished with my hands, which is why I like to build UIs. I also do that in some hobbies, as I told some people this morning. Like, I build rubber engine model airplanes from balsa wood every now and then. And then I joined a drawing course just now. But yeah, you might know me from such things as Elm Native UI, which has been a little dormant for a few months, but yeah, maybe I'll get back to that. You can come talk to me. I will tell you in more detail about how it's going and so on. And then I got some articles, one of which is actually nowadays featured in the Elm-Lang front page. So thank you, Evan, for that. And then I'm on Twitter, Slack, and GitHub. Basically, every single one of those is just Hanhi. So it's a shortening of my name. About the talk, because all of you know the benefits of Elm, I'm just going to skip those, basically. So what I'm going to talk about today is a personal experience of how it is to work with Elm, like in actual customer projects. So I'm going to give you a pragmatic, experience-based talk. So your mileage may vary. The contents of the talk are listed out there. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the projects, and then I'm going to touch on several aspects of what I've learned, such as project structure and refactoring, message passing, code reuse, and so on. I'm going to have some pro tips in there, and not war stories, but true stories. I tried to come up with a lot of war stories, but somehow it's kind of hard with Elm. But here comes the true story number 1. When I was starting the second project at work, I started with generalizing a lot of the Vue code, especially. So we had like forms in several places, and I wanted to make it like super general to make a, like, let's say a label and text input thing, and put that in the separate module and so on. But then, because it's an agile project, pretty much every single one of the forms got redesigned at some point, but one to another direction, one to another. It basically meant that I had to do the generalization multiple times, and it's just much more work than it would have been if I just had the same code in 2 places in the beginning. So what I do now is I consciously avoid abstracting in the beginning, and then only when I see that it's going to stabilize in some direction, then I'm going to do the generalization. Some vocabulary. I have come to the conclusion that the word component is a bit weird. So I'm going to try and use this word triplet instead, because it's just 3 functions, the init, update, and view. And then there's the model and the message types related to those. But that's basically what you have. You have an init function that returns a tuple, you know these things. The update is just the same, but it takes some parameters first. And then the view will return some HTML. Now, when I talk about a helper, I mean a function. It has whatever parameters and whatever return type you want. And when I'm talking about routing, which again is a controversial term, but anyway, I'm going to use that. I'm talking about the pages you can see in a single page application which have URLs. The first pro tip, Elm format, it rocks. You should definitely use that if you're making an application for work, because it just makes your life so much easier. You don't need to squabble about the style things, and basically all the Git diffs that you have will be so much easier to look at. So, the projects. I'm going to talk about them with their code names because they are customer projects. They are under NDA, so I only have the code names and rough wireframes here, but I think that's going to suffice. So the Ferrari project, that was mainly developed during the fall of 2015. It's the thing that I wrote about in the How Elm Made Our Work Better article. It was a tool for newspaper editors to set how the news lanes, as they call them, on newspaper site will show up. So they can choose the articles and the article blocks and how they look like with the tool. It's basically a drag and drop thing for choosing the news lane layout. That was started with Elm 015. It's been, well, I refactored it into 16, and I think it has been upgraded to 17 later. It had a single sign-on authentication, and it only works on the customer premises in the internal network, so authentication was not really a concern of ours in that application. Then the second one, D25, that's basically a simple social media of sorts. So you can register as a user, you can log in, you can interact with other users, and that's basically it. It was started in spring this year, so it was Elm 016 in the beginning, but it's been refactored into 17 nowadays. And we are using Sebastian Porto's hop for routing and navigation, and it's been working really nicely for us. True story number 2. The developer who joined the Ferrari project in a month's time, he wasn't part of the project in the beginning, but after a month he joined. He was very skeptical about the whole Elm thing. And then it was a bit hard for him to get started with the language. Then I ran into him in a bar half a year later. I had moved on from the project like several months ago, and what he told me is that he had been working with React and Redux lately, and he said that, well, it's okay, but it's nowhere close to how nice working with Elm is. Okay, on to the actual learning stuff. I used to read somewhere, I think this is from Richard Feldman actually, that well anyway, we are using this thing that I call the context pattern. The idea is really simple. You just have a single type alias, a record type for something that you want to pass as a context for given modules. So, for example, you can put host name and user, the current user, in there to pass into whatever pages or modules you want to put that into. This will give you like a really simple and straightforward way to communicate things that are rippling down from well, ancestors in your hierarchy. So you can get like the current user information anywhere in your application, and you don't need to do any message passing at all. So how you use it, I have an example here on the page.elm page module. You have an init function that has context as a parameter. So then you can store it in the local model if you want to, or you can pass it only to the view function if you so wish to. So it's a very versatile pattern that really works. Then there's an interesting true story. This might be a war story, actually. So in the Ferrari application, when we were first trying it out with actual, like real-world data, the app wouldn't start at all. We would actually get some errors in the console, even though the code was compiling perfectly. And we were a little dumbfounded. How can the data itself break our application? And after a little while, we found that it had something to do with integers. And then we looked at the data and found that the database IDs for stuff are actually more than what a 32-bit integer can hold. So that's what the error was. And then we circumvented the problem by using a float type for it. It works just fine because it's never updated anyway. So you can always be sure that the float will be the same anyway. But what we did was we defined a type alias called ID and used that to reference to the float type. And it's actually really, really nice. I suggest you use it as well because it documents your function signatures really nicely if you have ID int instead of int. So that was a lucky coincidence. All right, about authentication. If in any way possible, externalize it. I think you all know that it's not a very good idea to roll your own crypto, so don't roll your own authentication if you don't have to. But anyway, in the application side, you need to think about the goals you have. So is your application going to be used anonymously at all? If it is, should it be the same application for both logged in and logged out users? If you think about, let's say, Wikipedia, you can actually do pretty much anything in there without being logged in. But then again, services like Facebook or Twitter are seriously restricted if you're not logged in. You can basically only read stuff. So that's something you need to figure out. Also, likely you will have the routes to be different based on if your user is logged in or not. So it makes sense. You don't get to a login page if you're already logged in, and you don't get to a logout page or personal settings page if you're not logged in. So I'm going into more detail in the next slide, but first, pro tip number 2. If you're not using the remote data pattern by Chris Jenkins, you should be. It's such a simple thing. Basically, that's all it is, what I have on the slide. But it makes UI so much better. So the idea is that instead of using maybes for data that you're fetching from a server, you have a union type that can be not asked, loading, success, or failure. And that will give you the opportunity to show those states in the UI like correctly every time. That's also on package elm-lang.org as remote data, so you can just look it up. All right, so authentication, the common case. You have a simple flowchart here. Is the user logged in? No. You get to these pages: home, register, login. If the user is logged in, then you get to app/feed, notifications, messages, and settings. Now, how we did this in our current project is that we have a top-level router which handles the basic figuring out if the user is logged in or not, and will handle the actual routing between the routes that it actually knows itself, which are the home, register, and login pages, or whatever routes are in the logged in application. So that's called app router. And how we do this is that when the page is loaded, we send out immediately a status check, basically, to the backend. And the backend will respond with a response that contains either the whole logged in user data or a response that there's no logged in user with this session ID. And if the user exists, we can then initialize a context which has the user as a plain value. And then once we have the context ready, we can then initialize the app router with an actual context value, which means that within the app router, we never have to deal with the maybe situations. So we always have a context. We always have a user, which is really nice. If you have any questions about this, I'm happy to talk about more in the questions and answers session or later in the afternoon. But now it's time for a pro tip extravaganza. This is mainly about debug logging, but this is something you probably will be using So the first one, you can just go debug log within a case of clause. Really simple, but it's actually really useful in many cases, especially when you're dealing with updates. You can just slap in the debug log in the case of message part. That's it. And the second one, when you're dealing with tasks, which you nowadays usually only use when you need some sequential events or sequential commands, kind of. You can debug log both of the possible routes, like if it's a success or a failure. You can log both of those just by using a pipeline and calling task.map with a logging expression, and then task.mapError with the same logging, and it will log the actual task value no matter if it's a success or a failure. And then the last one, remember that you can check your pipeline transformations by debug logging above and below what you want to inspect. So here we have a thing, and we call squeeze on it. Then we log the squeezed value. Then we call tweeze on it, and then when we log, we will get like how did it change in between. All right, on to the project structure. With the Ferrari project, this was the first bigger application that I started to work on. And for some reason, I decided to make these folders called model, update, and view, which led to the situation where I had like 3 files called article open in the text editor at the same time. One of those was the model, one of those was the update, and one of those was the view. But even though the directory structure was like okay, it was pretty much impossible to work with those file names. So we ditched that really quickly and moved on to just combining the model and update to a one file called article.elm or block.elm or whatever the type is called. So we had about 5 core data types in the whole application, and those were all at the root level in the project. And then we kept the view directory structure because we found that actually it's kind of useful. It's reminiscent of how the UI works. The UI is always a tree of sorts. So you can reflect how the UI works with your directory structure, and it's like super easy to map that in your head. Okay, true story number 4. In the Ferrari project, in the beginning, we used to write unit tests for basically every single function in the beginning. We found that it's not actually helping us much because the majority of the functions were just returning HTML, and we were, well, the unit tests were not really fruitful for us. So what we did was we toned down a lot of what we unit test and focused only on the more difficult logical parts of the code. And we found that end-to-end testing is really what we want. So that will test also that correct buttons are shown and they are clickable and so on. So end-to-end testing, really good. And of course, I'm not saying that unit testing is like bad. Use it if you find that it's useful for you. Okay, the second application that we built, that was started with the Start app, which was like what elm-017 is, basically. So the initial model, based on what we found worked in the previous project, was that we just put all the files in one folder, and that's it. So we had pages and these triplets and routers all happily together in the one directory. And believe it or not, it actually worked for quite a while. So until we came to about 20 modules or so, it became a bit harder to find what you're looking for. But before that, it was actually really, really nice to have all the files. You just see them all at once. But then later, once we had a lot of different like use cases and how the modules interact, we decided to restructure it into something that was based on how the module is used. So this is our current structure. We have routers, which only have the app and the top level files. And that's going to be, you can call like routers.app.init, which is pretty self-documenting also. And then the same for types. Types contains stuff like context and ID. So just definitions for some type aliases that you use everywhere in the application. Those usually also contain encoders and decoders. Then we have pages, which correspond to the actual routes that you can navigate into. Those are all full triplets. Then we have helpers. You probably guess what they are. They are just any kind of functions that make your life easier, such as formatting names or formatting dates or what have you. And then finally, we have a folder called components, which only has very few modules. Those are the ones that could be separated from the pages and actually benefit from having their own separate state. Okay, pro tip number something, I don't know anymore. Ports are your friends. If you're on a schedule, think about when you're facing a difficult problem in Elm, and you know that it's easy to work around that using JavaScript, then just go for it. It's really simple nowadays, especially with 0.17, to just pop in a new port and then strip it off later when you have the time to refactor. So it can even be used for something like inter-application message passing in a pinch, but that's something I wouldn't really endorse. So, but I mean, there's a lot of potential to them. Okay, so my personal learnings over the almost year and a half. I've learned a lot about reuse. By that, I mean that everything is not a component. And sometimes the tool that you need is just that maybe you need to refactor the let block into separate functions. Or maybe you want to refactor the nested view functions into more detailed helper functions that you can use everywhere in the application then. But the end result is that functions are nice. State management is not nice. So try to keep on the function side as much as possible. And then another thing, especially as a consultant, I really try to think about in terms of return on investment. So if something takes a lot of time, doing it the elegant way in pure Elm, I try to think, how am I going to make it work now? Because it's very likely in an agile project that it's going to change anyway. So it makes sense to not go for the best possible, most elegant solution every time. So if it's going to take a lot of time, then figure out if it's actually something that will stick around for a long time. I mean, it's really hard for a programmer to accept that, but it's something to think about. And then I've learned about structuring, which is much simpler than it used to be. I just slap every single module in the same directory and be done with it. When it gets too much, then I refactor into what makes sense in that current project. And solving the problem at hand, that's like the whole key thing that I wanted to stress here. I mean that I don't want to componentize things anymore. I don't want to generalize beforehand. I just want to solve the current problem, the thing that makes the thing work. And then that will make it possible for me to move on. And then in retrospect, I can see the whole thing much clearer. That's all I had. Thank you a lot for listening to me, and I am ready for your questions in the QA session. Have a great day.